Thanks everyone for coming along. What I'm going to talk about today is basically going over the ideas in a theory paper that I've been writing with my supervisors, Katie and Alex. And it's titled, SITIAR, A Social Identity Theory of Information Access Regulation, Understanding the Psychology of Sharing and Withholding. So I'm going to start this talk off by creating kind of like an illustrative example to get you thinking about what the phenomena that I'm talking about are kind of like. And so one of my quarantine pleasures, I guess, the last few months has been reading the last of Hilary Mantel's books about Thomas Cromwell in the court of Henry VIII. And so just to kind of give you a bit of a background, if you kind of haven't read these, the idea that it is there's just this, in Henry VIII's court, there's just this constant, I guess, roundabout of scheming and double crossing and secrets and lies all going around each other's backs. A lot like kind of Game of Thrones or the Trump administration. You can kind of imagine the scene that might occur inside his privy chamber, which was like inside his residence with his inner circle. And so I just thought this would be an interesting example. So imagine that you were a member of that group within the privy chamber, and there would be information that you knew that no one else in the room knew. You know, there'd be secrets that you had, and you also know that everyone else in the room has secrets that you don't have. And so if that was the thing you were thinking about at the time, the secrets you held or the secrets that other people held, that might be the most obvious thing that might make it hard to feel like you're part of a cohesive group working together. On the other hand, sometimes you might be forming coalitions with other members of the group. So there'd be secrets you share with some members, but not others within the privy chamber. And you know there are these other kind of like little alliances going on as well. And so that might be kind of the most salient thing about the relationships in the room. You might be seeing a whole bunch of little subgroups working against each other. But then once you leave the privy chamber and you're walking through the streets of London, if someone asked you what you did today, and you know that the business discussed in the privy chamber is supposed to be confidential, you might not be able to tell them. And then you might be thinking about yourself as a member of the privy chamber, as a group that's working together for the government of England. And so I'm just this is just one of many examples. It's just one because I just finished the book, so I thought it'd be a good one. But of how there were these interlocking patterns of information access in our everyday lives, particularly in organizations, but also in our day-to-day lives as well. And so what I'm going to do today is discuss a theory I've come up with that tries to explain how these different things affect us psychologically and how this might have different outcomes for individuals and groups in different conditions. So I'm going to fast forward a few hundred years now. This is a picture from 2017 when the Richmond Tigers AFL team had just won their first premiership in 37 years. So I'm a Tigers fan, and so this was a big deal. This was like the first time they'd won in my lifetime, and they'd been the butt of jokes for years. You know, there was a perennial joke about them never being able to make the finals, let alone win. And in fact, they'd actually finished close to last the season before. And they were like a completely different team in this year. And everyone was trying to figure out why, what had changed. And it was exactly the same team, the same players, the same coach, the same captain, the same support staff, the same supporters. But they played much more intensely with more of a sense of purpose and of cohesive identity. And so one of the things that kept coming up in interviews was that at the beginning of the season that they had engaged in something they called group honesty sessions, where they would take turns, the players would take turns kind of sharing private stuff about themselves that no one else knew as a way to bond the group together. And apparently this had been really quite hard for them to do, but really effective in creating bonds between people in the group. And there's some research to show that this occurs in all kinds of groups. So groups that are defined by shared secrecy, like secret societies, tend to be more cohesive. And there's an example, one example of this is at a US company called PharmaCore, which sounds like a made-up name, but it is actually a real company. So it's a pharmaceutical company. And a group of scientists in that company kept working on an abandoned project in secret in one of the apartments of one of the members. And they ended up getting way more done in that little subgroup and being more cohesive than, they felt more part of that subgroup than they did a part of their organization. There's also research showing that disclosure to other people creates social closeness, and also keeping secrets in secrets with like a romantic partner, for example, tends to create cohesion between people. On the other hand, though, sometimes secret keeping leads people feeling alone and isolated, and this has negative impacts for them. So there's some research on the burden of secrecy, which shows that keeping secrets is cognitively taxing, and also quite a lot of research into concealment and the idea that people who have something they have to conceal on a daily basis, whether that be a stigmatized medical condition or identity, they often they feel isolated and find it hard to connect with other people. And this has quite severe impacts on their mental health in terms of anxiety, but also in terms of their physical health in a number of different areas, and also in their ability to form relationships with other people. And so what I'm going to try and argue today is that this kind of negative effects of secrecy and the positive effects of secrecy are actually two sides of the same coin. And they reflect the extent to which patterns of information access regulation allow people to feel a sense of shared identity or not. So before I go on further, I just want to introduce a new term, which is information access regulation, to describe the thing we're talking about here. Basically because there are a lot of terms that are quite similar in this area, like confidentiality, secrecy, privacy, gossip, disclosure, concealment, and they all have specific meanings. They are different ideas, but they're all quite closely related. So for example, group secrecy is confidentiality, like they are exactly the same thing. They just have different research traditions. And the problem with this is that each of these terms has their own set of theories. They're often in different fields. So group secrecy research has tended to be in sociology. There's a lot of research in anthropology. There's research in psychology, but they don't tend to overlap that much. And so it's kind of hard. I didn't want to make any of these terms subordinate to any other because I don't think it completely explains what we're talking about here. And this is just some examples from those literatures where even though that there's these specific meanings for each word, they tend to use those other terms synonymously to describe them, which just kind of demonstrates the confusion you can get into here. So information access regulation is any process by which access to information is intentionally withheld from others or shared with the intention that it should be withheld from a third party. So this includes individual and group secrecy and confidentiality, as well as informational privacy. There are some forms of privacy that have to do with physical privacy that isn't really covered by this. Also concealment and disclosure is kind of two sides of this. Disclosure basically to the extent that it has an implied third party. So not all disclosure has a third party from whom information is withheld. And same with gossip. So this kind of covers the types of gossip that exclude people, either implicitly or explicitly. So not all gossip has that element. And so if you look at the literatures that are covered by this definition, all those different terms I was mentioning, there's a few themes that keep coming up. And so one of these is that keeping information from others creates boundaries around people. In confidentiality, some researchers have called this the confidentiality bubble, which I think is a good metaphor for thinking about it. In sociology, there's a tradition that goes back almost 100 years, or more than 100 years, talking about secrecy as being a social form that can shape group dynamics and group identities. And so, yeah, that's one theme that comes through in a few different areas. The second is that people inside these boundaries tend to feel a sense of cohesion or social closeness. And so this is going back to that research I was talking earlier about group secrecy and disclosure kind of bringing people together. And the other theme is that keeping information from other people can lead to reduced well-being, physical and psychological. So that's that burden of secrecy and of concealment that I was referring to earlier. And so, yeah, this is our theory, a social identity theory of information access regulation. What I'm going to do is kind of step through the main hypotheses that make up this theory and then explain how they relate to those themes in the literature and how they can account for them. So this first idea that keeping information from others creates boundaries around people, according to our theory, this can be conceptualized as social categorization and specifically bottom-up social categorization. So the ways in which we perceive people as being joined in groups or as individuals. And the reason for this is that several of the kind of the strongest predictors of social categorization, bottom-up social categorization or entitativity, are things like similarity, interactivity, and common purpose. And all these are shaped by information access regulation. So information access regulation affects common purpose because people who are keeping these secrets together have a shared purpose to keep that secret. It affects interactivity because they are sharing information with each other. But it also affects similarity because they have something in common that others don't. And one of the key things about information access regulation that makes this stronger than other forms of information sharing is that there is a third party from whom the information is being withheld. So it creates a meta contrast. Because there are people who it isn't being shared with, that makes the similarity between those who have the information even stronger. So I think it's quite a strong basis for categorizing people as individuals or groups. So I've just realized I've got the screens in the way of my slides. So hypothesis one is that information access regulation will increase the extent to which those given access to the information are perceived as comprising a social category. And this, by social category, this could be individual, this could be group, this could be category more broadly defined. And the second theme, that people inside these boundaries feel a sense of cohesion or social closeness. If we're taking this idea that the boundaries are social categorization, then you can explain this by thinking of it as shared social identity. And so the idea here is that to the extent that these categories that are being formed bottom up by information access regulation include the self, people should feel like they are more similar to other group members and they share an identity with them. And this is what we're arguing is the sense of cohesion or social closeness experienced by people who have access to the same information. So information access regulation will lead to an increased sense of shared social identity among those given access to the information. And this leads to another hypothesis that is touched on a little bit in the literature, but it leaves open a few kind of things that are worth exploring. It's because, as we all know, shared social identity increases group effectiveness in terms of trust, productivity, motivation, and communication. So the extent that information access regulation increases social identity within a group, it should improve these group outcomes. And this last theme, that keeping information from other people can lead to reduced well-being, there are a few ways we can think about this. One of them is that it's just a lack of shared social identity. So the opportunity of creating togetherness with other people provided by shared secrecy, for example, if that doesn't occur, then there's like a lack of opportunity of that. Because there's a lot of research showing that people's physical and mental well-being is influenced quite strongly by the extent to which they feel part of groups. But the other kind of argument here that might be a bit more of a stretch is that even with people's existing group memberships, if secret keeping makes people's personal identity salient in a way that conflicts with those group identities. So for example, if you're keeping a lot of secrets individually, but you're part of a group that values transparency, it might make your personal identity salient at the expense of the group identity, potentially even reducing existing benefits of belonging to groups. So to the extent that information access regulation increases social identification in an individual, we predict this would lead to improved well-being. And also, if it reduces social identification, it would lead to reduced well-being. So there are a few implications of this theory for those literatures I was talking about earlier, because it does account for those findings, but it also generates a few untested ideas that I think would be interesting to test. So in terms of secrecy, one of the principles of self-categorization theory is this meta-contrast principle, which is that we tend to see individuals as forming a group to the extent that within group similarities outweigh between group similarities. And our argument here is that group secrecy and intergroup secrecy might affect this ratio. So if sharing information with a whole group should make that group seem more similar to each other, increasing the ratio, but sharing it with an outgroup should make the outgroup more similar to the in-group and reduce the ratio. So to the extent that group secrecy kind of highlights similarities within the group and separates it from others, it should increase shared identity and therefore improve group dynamics within groups. And to the extent that it kind of waters down those boundaries, it should reduce them. And so these ideas haven't really been tested experimentally in group secrecy literature. In terms of privacy, so we're talking about informational privacy here. And in general, privacy is considered to be good for individuals because it allows them to maintain a degree of autonomy and control over themselves. But the literature has generally compared privacy maintained to privacy breached from outside, so loss of autonomy and control. It hasn't really looked at privacy, individual privacy maintained versus shared with others. And so what we would predict is that when you share private information with other people in a way that you still have autonomy over it, it should potentially create a basis for shared social identity and therefore be good for individuals. And confidentiality, so this hasn't really been looked at in psychology, which is why I'm doing my thesis on it. But we would predict very similar things with confidentiality to group secrecy because functionally they're the same thing. And particularly these ideas that different overlapping patterns of confidentiality, for example, in organizations, might affect the extent to which groups can work together depending on whether they increase shared identity, whether they overlap the group boundaries or cut across them. And I'm going to present some research I've done that kind of support this with relation to confidentiality. In terms of disclosure and concealment, it doesn't really provide so much new avenues for research here, but it kind of helps to explain why disclosure is good for individuals and why concealment is bad for them psychologically, and how these problems might be overcome. And then in terms of gossip, and specifically the kind of gossip where information is being withheld from others, it implies that gossip might actually be good for group cohesion to the extent that it delineates group boundaries and doesn't cut across them. And more broadly, it just kind of brings together a bunch of related literatures that have been siloed a bit. So even within these literatures we've been talking about, there's been quite a few review papers that are calling for more integration across these related concepts, as well as at different levels of analysis. And so one of the great things about a social identity approach is because it can link individual psychological processes to group processes really effectively. And so by taking that lens, it allows us to look at this at multiple levels. Okay, so that's our theory. And there are a lot of things that haven't been tested with it so far, but we have tested some of these ideas when it comes to confidentiality and keeping of other people's secrets. So confidentiality is when information is shared with at least one person and withheld from at least one other person. So it's a form of group secrecy that has an implicit group to whom it shouldn't be shared. And so I'm going to talk about 5 studies here, and they all followed they all used the same kind of paradigm. So we got participants to imagine they're part of an organization, and then a team within that organization called the RED team, or the Research, Engineering and Development team. And we got them to write about why being in the RED team would be good to kind of reinforce that identity. And then we got them to look at 4 interactions. So these would they were represented by pictures with text. I'll give you an example in a second of that. They look at 4 of these within each condition between subjects. And these would be about information sharing. We'd vary various things about that information sharing to test our hypotheses. So study 1 was with MTech, with US participants. And our design here was the information being shared in those scenarios was either non-confidential or confidential. And it was either shared with the whole in-group or just some group members. So this is what it would look like so there would be 4 examples where each person had a turn talking, but this is what it would look like, one example for the confidential group condition. And so confidentiality was just manipulated by basically taking out that underlined bit or not. So it's the same information in both cases. And so what we found was this effect on perceived sensitivity that we would expect. So when the information being shared with the individual or the group was confidential, there was this idea that when it was shared with individuals instead of the group, it led to a lack of, the group was seen as less entitative. It was seen as less of as a cohesive whole. And we actually found the same effect on group identification. So essentially when confidentiality was splitting the group, it was reducing group identification. And we didn't find either effect for non-confidential information. What we also found was an indirect effect of sharing for confidential information, whereby sharing with the whole group made the group seem more entitative, and therefore people identified more with the group. So this is in line with what we would predict. So in study 2, this is again on MTech, we had the same design. This time we wanted to check that the effect we found wasn't just because participants in the individual condition felt implicitly excluded, and because it wasn't being shared with them, whereas being shared with everyone in the group condition. So we included participants in the scenarios as the recipient in all conditions. So they were either the only recipient of the information or they received it along with the whole group. So that's what this would look like for that same condition. And what we found was the same effect on perceived sensitivity. So even when the participant was the only one receiving the information in all these different interactions, versus the whole group, they felt like the group was less of a cohesive whole. But that wasn't the case for non-confidential information. We didn't find an effect on group identification. And one reason for this, because we did find an indirect effect, as we did in study 1, but no direct effect. And so what we're thinking here is that potentially, if you're the sole recipient of confidential information in a group, it might make you feel like a high status or privileged group member, and that is associated with higher group identification. So that might wipe out this effect via perceived sensitivity. But obviously worth following up, but it wasn't kind of like the key point of our study, so we decided to test something else. So this was a study with 400 undergrad students at UQ. And in this, we ditched the non-confidential conditions because we weren't finding any effects on those. So I think we'd established that it isn't just about sharing information, it's about confidential information. So we had, as before, information shared with the whole in-group or just individual in-group members. We also had the information either shared with an out-group or not. So we introduced another team within the organization called the blue team. And it was kind of depicted like this. So either the information was shared with the whole blue team or it wasn't shared at all with the blue team. They were included or excluded. And this is testing whether that meta-contrast principle is operating here. And what's kind of cool is we did find results and sensitivity that were consistent with that idea. So if you remember that ratio is that you should see people as a group to the extent that within group similarity is larger than between group similarity. And the highest sensitivity was when information was shared with the whole in-group, so the in-group had a lot in common, and it wasn't shared at all with the out-group, so the in-group was different to the out-group. And the in-group was seen as least entitative when confidential information wasn't shared with some in-group members, so there was within-group difference, and it was shared outside the group. So confidentiality wasn't really contributing as much to seeing the in-group as a cohesive whole. So this is kind of what we would expect based on the meta-contrast principle. We didn't find an effect on group identification, although we did find indirect effects of both in-group and out-group sharing in the directions we would expect via perceived sensitivity. And the reason for this potentially, again, is that there might be another variable going in the opposite direction, suppressing the direct effect. In this case, it could be that if you're seeing confidential information shared without the out-group, it might seem like the in-group is under threat of some kind, which could increase group identification. Again, worth following up, but not our specific focus in these studies. In study 4, this again with undergrad students, we wanted to look at whether just in-group sharing this time, so we got rid of the out-group condition. We just wanted to see whether in-group sharing might have an effect on behavior on behalf of the group, because that's something we'd expect based on the theory, right? If we've increased shared identity in a group, people should care more about the group. They should try harder on tasks that benefit the group. So we got participants to do a word search task where they did a practice one so we could get their baseline score, and they did a final one that we tested. And the idea was that their performance in this task was supposed to help contribute to the group's overall performance. And what we found was that controlling for baseline, participants generated more words and spent more time on the task, so productivity and persistence were increased when they saw confidential information being shared with the whole group instead of just individual group members. So this is pretty cool because it shows that this isn't just affecting how people are seeing groups and relating to them, but also how they're acting on behalf of those groups. And in study 5, we'd found in all 4 studies this consistent indirect effect of sharing on group identification via sensitivity, which is our proxy for bottom-up social categorization. We decided to try and manipulate the mediator to try and provide more causal evidence. So we'd found this statistical effect, but that doesn't necessarily mean that the mediator was causing this. So we decided to manipulate the mediator. And this was a blockage design where, if you remember from previous studies, there was this effect whereby sharing confidential information with individual group members reduced sensitivity and reduced group identification. And so if sensitivity is what's leading to the effect on group identification, if you boost sensitivity, then that effect on group identification should be reduced. So that was the kind of the hypothesis here. And so we designed a manipulation of group sensitivity based on factors that are supposed to be related to it. So we described the red team either as high in those factors, so They were, quite interactive. They hung out a lot outside work. They had a sense of common purpose. They were quite different to members of other teams. And a similar number, in the control condition, we had a similar number of positive statements about the team that weren't theoretically related to sensitivity. So the team was productive and it had been around a long time, for example. And so we pilot tested that and it seemed to work on sensitivity. So we went ahead and ran the study. And we found that this is basically what we're expecting. So this is the pattern we're expecting, whereby that, I'll get my mouse up here. This pattern on the left is what we'd found in previous studies, and it's reduced when we boost sensitivity because it's making up for the drop in sensitivity here, over here. This interaction was marginally significant, p equals 0.06, so pretty close to significant, but it's definitely the pattern we were expecting. So to kind of summarize these results, there are some inconsistencies, but overall, I think we can say that our theory is supported in the domain of confidentiality over a number of different predictions. So in terms of our next steps, with the confidentiality stuff, we're writing it up now as a paper, separate to the theory paper. But I think the kind of most important next step with that work is to test this in a more naturalistic context, because it's quite an artificial hypothetical scenario. And I think it would be good to see whether this effect still is robust if it's a bit more noisy and a bit more realistic. So either small group studies or organizational studies, things like that. And in terms of following up the theory, I think to me, the most interesting thing to follow up would be the predicted effects of individual secrecy and privacy and concealment. So whether that actually reduces group identification when the identities are incongruent, or whether it's just that they don't increase it relative to sharing with others. So that would be interesting to test as well. So yeah, thanks very much. I'll just quickly kind of recap what I've been talking about. So we've presented a theory of information access regulation based on the social identity approach that's trying to explain why sharing secrets can be good, well, secrecy can be good and it can be bad, and related concepts for individuals and groups, articulating the psychological processes by which this happens and its effects on individuals and groups, and presented some studies that support this in the domain of confidentiality. Thanks very much.